This is something that you have to do in your interviews, in your applications. If you don't do this, you are not going to get the job. So I want to give you 6 ways of using those reflective models, but making sure that we're using them well and not like a tick box exercise. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Psych Diaries. I am your host, Maya. If you're an aspiring psychologist like me, join me on my journey on discovering how to become a good psychologist, because they don't teach you this in the psychology undergrad. Thanks for being here. I'm so glad you're here today. In this episode, I'm going to tell you 6 ways to reflect like a psychologist. Why do you need this skill? This will be useful for everything you do in your career in psychology, for your applications, for your interviews, for when you're working, even when you're at uni. You can use this skill to improve what you're currently doing. Being reflective is something that they expect us to know. Like if you're applying for the doctorate in psychology or assistant psychologist posts, they kind of expect you to know how to do this without really being taught that it's important and how to actually do it. I'm going to tell you the reflective models to use, but you've probably already heard of those if you've watched other YouTube videos or other podcasts out there talking about how to be reflective. But I want to talk about what kind of answers to give and how to actually think like a psychologist, not just what questions to ask yourself to be reflective, but also whether our reflections are on the right track and how to steer them in the way a psychologist would think. So, that's what we're talking about today. First of all, let's define reflective practice. According to the British Psychological Society, the BPS, reflective practice is learning through and from experience towards gaining new insights of self and practice. So basically, what that means is from any situation that has happened to you clinically. For example, it could be a client getting distressed, which is very common in the field of mental health. We can take that situation and ask ourselves, what can we learn from it? What were the good things that happened? What did we do that went well? What did we do that didn't go so well? How did we think about it using psychological frameworks? How can we think about it more deeply? What can we do differently next time? What have we learned from that situation? This is something that you have to do in your interviews, in your applications, but interviews especially. If you don't do this, you are not going to get the job. It is as simple as that. This is something that you have to do, and you have to learn to do this and incorporate this into your answers whenever you go for interviews. Before I get into the 6 specific ways that you can think like a psychologist in your reflections, I want to reiterate how important it is to start writing things down, to start keeping maybe a reflective journal if you can. And whenever something comes up, whenever you have a situation at work or even in your personal life, maybe with a friend or a relative who's going through something stressful where you can apply psychology in some way, start using any situation that you can to be more reflective and just start writing it down, because it will come in so useful later down the line when you start going for interviews and you want to pull out things, pull out different scenarios, different examples where you've really learnt something and that has improved how you are as a practitioner, an aspiring psychologist. So that's the first thing that I want you to do. Start writing things down. The good situations, the bad situations, interesting conversations, maybe once a week or once a month. Jot down things that have stood out to you at work or at uni in your personal life and start getting into the habit of practicing being reflective. Okay, so there are 2 reflective models that I'm aware of and that I've used in the past, and I know that other people applying for assistant psychologist posts and doctorates have used before as well that have been successful. So it's the Gibbs model and the so what structure. I'm not sure if that's the actual correct name of it, but that's kind of how I remember it. So, first, the Gibbs reflective model, which is a bit more expanded, a bit longer than the so what model. There are 6 stages in this model. So, the first one is description, just what happened. So, I'll give maybe a situation, actually, an example. For example, 2 clients had some kind of conflict, and I was working alone and had to deal with that conflict. Maybe the question is, give me an example of a time when you've dealt with conflict. In this example, 2 clients had an argument and they're very dysregulated, very frustrated. So if I use the Gibbs reflective cycle, the first one would be description. So what happened? So the 2 clients were fighting upstairs. They were having an argument. I could hear them. So I went to see what was going on. And one of the clients shut the door and the other got very angry and started shouting at me. I tried to stay very calm and de-escalate the situation, let everyone have space and time apart and calm down. Okay, that's a very brief description. The second stage is feelings. What were you thinking and feeling at the time? For me, I was feeling very panicked and anxious because I didn't know what they would do, how they would react, whether they were at risk to each other, whether I was at risk, whether they were going to get violent, all those things. So I was very panicked and anxious. And then evaluation. What was good and bad about the experience? So, what was good was that I was able to calm them down, to de escalate the situation. I asked them to give each other space and a bit of time. And after a while, I went to check in on both of them to try and resolve the situation and to ask how each of them were feeling. What was bad about the experience? I could have called my manager who was on call a lot earlier in case the situation did escalate and I was at risk because I was lone working. I could have called the crisis team. I could have checked in on how the clients were doing the next time I was in and follow up more on the situation, for example. So that's the third stage, evaluation. And then the fourth stage is analysis. What sense can you make of the situation? What psychological frameworks can we implement, incorporate into this? So maybe one of the clients was more dysregulated than usual because they had run out of money. This is a pattern that we've seen in the past. Whenever they run out of money at that time in the month, they become more agitated and easily irritated. So this could stem from a feeling of maybe lack of safety, lack of control. A lot of anxiety stems from needing a sense of control and feeling like you're not in control. That's probably not a very good example of a psychological framework, but just for the sake of explaining this model, that's what we're going to go for. Then the fifth stage is the conclusion. So, what happened at the end? What else could you have done? I could have checked in on them more and called my manager in case anything happened, in case the situation escalated. And then the sixth and final stage is the action plan. So, what would you do differently if that situation came up again? So, it could be I would take this to supervision, reflect more deeply on this, and also process my own emotions, my own reactions. Maybe it's taking care of yourself a bit more, calling a friend, or going for a run, whatever it is that you need to do for self care. So that's a rough outline of the Gibbs model. And as you can see, the way I'm answering those questions isn't probably how a psychologist would think. It seems very basic. That's not a fault of the model itself. It's just how do we know whether we're answering the questions well, whether we're actually reflecting in a way that they want us to and in a way that a psychologist would. The so what structure is somewhat similar, but a more concise version of the Gibbs model. It's basically just what, which is what happened, what was the situation. Then so what, which is what did you learn from that? What was good? What was bad? All the kind of analysis. And then now what? What are you going to do differently next time? As you can see with both of these models, they are useful as a good starting point, but I think it's very easy to answer those questions in a very simplified way unless we know how to actually think like a psychologist and answer those in a specific way, then we're not actually being that reflective. So, I want to give you 6 ways of using those reflective models, but making sure that we're using them well, that we're actually reflecting like a psychologist and not like a tick box exercise where we're just kind of answering the questions. Okay, so number 1, go beyond description. It's not good enough to just describe what happened. So, like in my previous example using the Gibbs model, I said the clients did this, I did that, and the result was this. That's kind of that's not good enough. So, let me give you like a weak example and a strong example. So, a weak example would be I worked with a client who was anxious. I used grounding techniques and it helped. That's really giving us nothing. We need to spice it up a little bit. So I'm going to give you a stronger example. For example, I recognized the client's anxiety might be linked to trauma. I used grounding to promote emotional regulation, guided by trauma informed principles. I reflected afterwards on how I could better pace interventions. So that obviously wouldn't be a full answer, but you can get an idea of how we're going beyond just describing and thinking about why we were doing certain things or why the client may have been behaving the way they were. I want you to ask yourself, am I explaining why I did what I did, linking it to theory and evidence and psychological knowledge? So that's number 1. Number 2, you show awareness of your own reactions, your own biases. It is absolutely key that we reflect on our own thoughts, our own feelings, our own reactions. It seems kind of counterintuitive because at an interview, we obviously want to sell ourselves and showcase ourselves as the best candidate. But they actually want us to recognize our own limits and recognize that we're not perfect people and we're not going to know everything about the client. So we're going to get things wrong. We're going to make mistakes. It's actually better if we do recognize that in ourselves to improve and become better practitioners. So for this one, you can say things like, when a client didn't want to engage in a session, I found myself getting very frustrated or taking it personally and seeing it as a failure. I noticed that I started blaming myself, and that made me reflect on those feelings, thoughts, and assumptions. I realized X, Y, and Z. So, for this second one, showing awareness of your own biases, I want you to ask yourself, am I noticing and analyzing my own internal processes and not just the client's? Number 3, you want to link the experiences that you're talking about to psychological models and frameworks. You want to show that you have that psychological knowledge and you're applying it to everyday situations, to situations with clients. And that will really show that you're thinking like a psychologist. So we can bring in cognitive models or behavioral models, maybe attachment theory, internal family systems. There's so many different approaches in psychology. And we want to show that we're able to make sense of what happened with different theories. This is actually something I need to improve on personally. An example could be I noticed that a client's regular disengagement could be to do with their avoidant attachment style. And this helped me to reframe their non engagement as safety seeking rather than resistance. The question I want you to ask yourself is, am I grounding my reflections in psychological theory, psychological knowledge? And am I applying that knowledge? Number 4, consider multiple perspectives. We want to be aware of our own perspectives, the client's perspectives, but also the wider team. There's a reason why in the NHS we work in multidisciplinary teams because we can learn from each other. If we're working with speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, psychiatrists, nurses, neurologists, or also the family, we want to include everyone that's involved in that client's care in our reflections, in making sense of that situation. So, a question that you can ask yourself is, have I considered this situation from the client's view, the family's view, the team's view, the wider context, maybe the culture, the society that they were brought up in? There's so many different factors and perspectives to consider. And all these different factors can have big impacts on the client's behavior. Number 5 is identifying learning and future development. Because what is the point of reflecting if we're not going to change our practice and make sure that we're improving? So we want to show them that we are learning from those experiences and we'll take steps to improve in the future. Something that you can say is, after this experience, I sought supervision to explore how I manage uncertainty in the workplace, how that makes me feel, and how I instinctively react, and what I can do to take a step back and manage it better next time. Or you can say that this experience has taught me the importance of neurodiversity affirming practices. And next time, I want to make sure that I'm using neurodiversity affirming language. So, the main questions that I want you to ask yourself for this one is, what did I learn and what will I do differently next time? So, we're on to the last one now. After I do this one, I'll guide us through an example of a very standard answer and an answer that incorporates all these 6 points. Bear in mind that you don't have to include all of them, but it's just to kind of show you the different ways that you can use these 6 points to reflect like a psychologist. Okay, so the final way to reflect like a psychologist is being honest about complexity. Thinking like a psychologist means seeing nuance, seeing clients as not just bad or difficult or showing challenging behavior or good clients. It's never black and white. And if you want to think like a psychologist, you want to show that you recognize that you're considering different perspectives, different approaches. I think as a psychologist, we shouldn't be seeing any behavior as bad. Every behavior communicates something. It's okay to not know all the answers, and it's actually good if you show that you're comfortable with ambiguity and complexity and that you don't know everything, but you're considering different options. And I think compassion comes into this as well. If you're seeing someone as a nuanced individual, a complex individual, that isn't just good or bad, you're humanizing them in a way. You're showing them compassion because you're saying, I'm trying to understand you. I want to understand what makes you you, and I want to know all the complexities about you. The question that I want you to ask yourself with this one is, am I showing that I'm comfortable with a client's complexity? So, if you're doing these things, then you're probably thinking critically, showing clinical insight, you're showing self awareness, and you're showing an understanding of psychology and how to apply psychology in different situations. But to help you understand how to actually use those 6 points in one cohesive answer, I'm going to give you an example now. So let's say you were asked the question, can you tell us an example of a time when you dealt with a client who was distressed? So in this scenario, I could say, for example, during a session, I worked with a nonverbal autistic child who became highly distressed when we had to move rooms unexpectedly. And I could see they were distressed because they were vocalizing loudly and flapping their hands and refused to enter the new room. I instinctively offered a sensory toy to calm them down, and this worked temporarily. But on reflection, I realized that this response was a bit surface level and didn't address the underlying anxiety. So I'm just going to stop there. We're already in this example going into a bit more depth. We're going beyond description. We're explaining why I did what I did to calm them down. I explained how I made sense of their distress by what I saw by their behavior. So, this is number one, going beyond description. Number two, showing awareness of own biases. When I said I realized this response was surface level and I don't really think about the underlying issue in the moment, that's showing awareness of own limitations. And I'm already starting to think about the complexity of the individual, about the underlying anxiety, the underlying issue. Let's carry on. So then in supervision, I use the ABC model, which is the antecedent, behavior, consequence model, which is what came before the behavior, the actual behavior, and then the consequence. I identified the room change as the antecedent to the behavior, which was the vocalizations, the flapping, the refusal to move rooms, the dysregulation. And this triggered the distress. I also applied a cognitive model to think about what could be causing the anxiety. So I tried to understand the behavior as a nonverbal response to a perceived threat, meaning that the child needed predictability and emotional safety rather than a distraction. If I stop here, as we can see with this one, I am using number 3, linking to psychological models and frameworks to make sense of what happened. Moving on, I noticed I felt frustrated and rushed, wanting to fix the situation. Reflecting on this, I realized that I was actually uncomfortable with not having a solution. This showed me how my own emotional state can alter what I decide to do in an intervention, in a session. And this reinforced the importance of tolerating and being okay with uncertainty in the workplace. Here, I hope you can see that we're showing awareness of our own reactions, emotional states, and identifying learnings, what we took away from that, what we learned from that. So after this, I spoke with the speech and language therapy team and the class team to implement social stories with this child to help them anticipate future transitions. From a systemic angle, I shared these insights with the team to improve how we all manage unexpected changes more broadly as a school. Here we're drawing on number 4, considering multiple perspectives, bringing in the team, the speech and language therapy team, the school team, and we're identifying learning and future development. We're implementing things for the future to make this better for next time. So, overall, this experience helped me shift from managing behavior to understanding it as communication. It taught me to approach situations more reflectively, to use psychological knowledge in real time where possible, and respond in ways that are trauma informed and neurodiversity affirming. So here we're concluding, showing that we understand the complexity of the situation and the importance of drawing on trauma informed care and neurodiversity affirming approaches, and what we've learned that we can bring forward into our practice. I hope this has helped. I hope that you feel more confident about being reflective and thinking like a psychologist. If you haven't already, this is your sign to start a reflective journal. It will really help you in the long run. Trust me on that one. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. If you found this episode helpful, give this podcast a 5-star rating. I would so appreciate that because it means that we can reach more people and more aspiring psychologists like yourself who will hopefully also find this helpful. Let's share the love. I will speak to you in the next episode. Bye.